I was in Ethan Klein's and Hasan Piker's debate. Ethan played a clip of Hasan reacting to a video of mine in which I refuted Ethan's dishonesty and omission surrounding the Nakba. We'll get back to this, but let's just say there's a reason why Ethan cut my clip off where he did. I'm going to be making this quick and hopefully short video to disprove Ethan's mischaracterizations of the Nakba and the events that contextualize it, his dishonest representation of Iraqi-Israeli historian Avi Shlaim and his book 3 Worlds, and to contend with the blatant racism Ethan displayed during that segment. I'm not going to get into iDubbbz's content cop or the whole swastika sword that is and isn't a swastika mess.
It's not a swastika, and you know it's not a swastika.
I mean, it literally is a swastika.
I genuinely thought it was a swastika memorabilia. Do you think I would keep it in my house?
Dude, you're being so obtuse. I know it's not a swastika.
I'll pass on Schrodinger's swastika and stick only to Ethan's ahistoricity. Right off the bat, Ethan falsely conflates the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, with the emigration of Jewish people from the MENA region to Israel. He made this claim in his content nuke.
After all, Israel is a country of refugees. If the Jews didn't come from Europe after the Holocaust, they came from the surrounding Arab countries that expelled them in massive amounts following the 1948 war. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians during the Nakba. 1 million Jews.
And decided to stand by it during his debate with Hasan.
You said, in the context puke, you said, this was the worst thing I did, so let me play it, okay? And then we can discuss. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians.
This was one of the worst pieces of misinformation I've seen in the fucking context puke, for the record. It was crazy.
This specific...
So Mike, again, nicely done. Let this guy hold your hand and formulate your opinions, but he's not here to help you, okay? So you tell me, what was wrong with what was misinformation about saying that 900,000 Jews were displaced?
He presents these two distinct situations, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the displacement of Arab Jews, as if they're morally symmetrical, when they're not. And to support that argument, he cites the work of Avi Shlaim, specifically Shlaim's book 3 Worlds. Ethan carefully frames his question to Hasan by asking,
what was misinformation about saying that 900,000 Jews were displaced?
But don't be misled by that framing. It's true that around 850,000 Jews left MENA countries for Israel, but the way Ethan poses that question implies a false equivalence, as if this were a mere case of mutual displacement. In reality, the forces behind the migration of Arab Jews were far more complex and included significant Zionist influence. In some cases, that included false flag bombing campaigns aimed at Jewish targets committed by the Zionist underground and blamed on local Arab communities to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Israel. The newly founded Israeli state was desperate to boost its Jewish population and secure a demographic majority, even though Arab Jews faced systemic racism from their European counterparts once they arrived. Meanwhile, these immigrants were often settled in Palestinian homes on expropriated land, while Palestinians themselves were ethnically cleansed, killed, or forced into exile. Not to mention, the migration of Jews to Palestine started well before 1948 and took place over the course of many, many years. That's not a mirror image, that's a power imbalance that can't be justified under any circumstances. And you know who agrees with my assessment? Avi Shlaim, the guy Ethan is mischaracterizing. Shlaim literally makes that point in his book 3 Worlds. Klein even condescendingly asks Hasan if he's ever read the book, to which Hasan replies that he hasn't, but he's read Shlaim's other works.
3 Worlds. Have you read that book?
No, I have not read 3 Worlds.
Okay, well, you're using a lot of source from it. It's a book that he wrote about his migration.
It's not the only book he wrote about this. But go on.
Have you read any of the other ones?
Yes.
Really? Which ones?
The book that I'm referencing is from the Iron Wall.
Then Ethan goes on to heavily imply that he himself has either read the book or is very familiar with its contents.
3 Worlds, okay? He writes about his time in Iraq. He writes about his time in Israel. He writes about his time in the UK.
However, the events that follow prove that Ethan has no clue what Avi Shlaim's thesis is, nor has he actually read the book. Ethan seems to believe that Avi Shlaim, an anti-Zionist Arab Jew who supports a one-state solution, agrees with him that the exodus of Jews from Iraq and other MENA countries was morally comparable to the Nakba and simply caused by Arab racism and ideological anti-Semitism. But Shlaim actually argues the opposite. In 3 Worlds, he contends that ideological anti-Semitism was a European malady that later infected the Near East. He attributes the hostility toward Jews in Iraq and other MENA countries to the political fallout from European colonialism, the Zionist project, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, not to some ingrained ideological Arab anti-Semitism. Iraq, after all, had a long-standing, well-integrated Jewish community. As I said, Ethan opens this segment by downplaying the Nakba and conflating it with the Jewish exodus from MENA countries. He cites Shlaim to justify this moral flattening, but if he'd just let my video play for a few seconds longer, he'd have seen this direct quote from Three Worlds, the very book he claims to be familiar with. I want to quote Avi Shlaim once more in regard to this claim. Zionists are driven by the propaganda need to portray the Jews as the victims of endemic Arab persecution, a portrayal that is then used to justify Israel's own atrocious treatment of the Palestinians. A rich, fascinating, and multi-dimensional history is thus reduced to a quest for ammunition to use in the ongoing war against the Palestinians. This trend reached its climax with the manufacture of the narrative of the Jewish Nakba. According to this narrative, the forced exodus of 850,000 Jews from Arab countries after 1948 amounted to a catastrophe, a Jewish Nakba, at least on par with, if not more devastating in its consequences than the Palestinian Nakba. Variously called the Forgotten Exodus, the Forced Exodus, or the Double Exodus, the purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it's the propaganda of the victors. Honest history has to acknowledge the part played by all the governments concerned in causing this man-made tragedy. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying. So right off the bat, Shlaim argues against Ethan, and since this specific quote was inconvenient for Klein, he acted as though it didn't exist. I'm fairly certain he saw it because he played a clip of my video and then he quickly turned it off before the quote appeared on the screen. Also, it's literally only 17 pages into the book. Ethan, you only had to actually read one chapter. On the page prior, Avi says that the history of the Mizrahim has been deliberately distorted to serve Zionist propaganda, and Ethan is proving his point. Avi's central argument is that the Zionist movement played a major role in fueling hostility toward Jewish communities in the MENA region, and that the subsequent migration of Jews to Israel should not be equated with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as doing so is historically inaccurate. Ethan pulls one quote from Shlaim.
He said, "We did not leave Iraq because we were Zionists. We left because we were no longer safe."
And assumes that Shlaim is on his side, but as we will see, this is not true. One thing I want to make abundantly clear before we go any further is that there absolutely was hostility toward Jews in MENA countries, especially post-1948. This had little to do with ideological anti-Semitism in the genocidal way Europeans exhibited it, and nearly everything to do with geopolitical factors leading to intense nationalism. So although Jewish people may not have been forcefully expelled, and in some instances countries had laws on the books to prevent Jews from leaving, the conditions they were subjected to post-48 were horrible in a lot of instances. To use Iraq as an example, Jews were not forced out at gunpoint, as Ethan kind of implies, and Jewish immigration was actually illegal at one point, but that doesn't change the fact that Jews were subjected to harsh and coercive conditions, fueled by Iraqi anger over the loss of Palestine, resentment towards Zionism and the creation of a settler colony in the Middle East, and the perceived connection between Jews and the British, whose colonial legacy was widely despised in Iraq. It may seem like a small thing I'm harping on here, but it's imperative to understand the distinction between the genocidal ideological anti-Semitism of Europe and the hostility toward Jewish people that arose largely as a response to external political elements in the MENA region. The depth of dishonesty in which Zionists are willing to sink to further their narrative is astonishing. Another example of this is how Ethan lies about the nature of the Iraqi bombings. When Ethan is discussing the false flag bombing campaigns in Iraq, mostly carried out by the Zionist underground to convince Iraqi Jews to flee the country, Ethan falsely and smugly claims that 100,000 Jews were already registered to leave Iraq before the bombs went off.
Before the bombs went off, 100,000 of the 125 Jews were already registered to leave. Do you want to explain that?
However, this is a blatant lie. Shlaim explains how Zionist groups were formed for the expressed purpose to speed up Jewish emigration from Iraq because the turnout of Jews registering to leave Iraq was underwhelming. Following the passage of the denaturalization law, a small group consisting of Israeli envoys and local Zionists was formed to speed up the process of registration and emigration. The response of the Jewish community to the law was slow and hesitant. Only hundreds came forward in the initial phase. The Israeli authorities were seriously disappointed by this response. Consultations took place, and a decision was reached to take action to encourage Jews to give up their Iraqi citizenship. Israel needed the manpower both to build the country and to boost numbers in the army. At the same time, Israel's population was tiny, only 600,000 people, while surrounded by Arab countries with a combined population of tens of millions. There was an urgent need to increase numbers on the Jewish side of the demographic equation. It also says, Zionists exploited the bombing incidents, issuing warnings to the Jews to hurry up and leave the country before it was too late. It's also worth noting that just because someone registered to leave under the denaturalization law didn't mean they actually intended to. Quote, many of the Jews who registered under the law had not finally made up their mind to surrender their Iraqi citizenship. They simply wanted to give themselves a way out should the situation become intolerable. So no, 100,000 Jews were not registered to leave before the bombs. I'm assuming Ethan probably read this Wikipedia article and came across this quote by Moshe Gat that says, just over 105,000 Jews had registered to leave by 8 March, and Ethan probably just stopped his research there. However, if you read the book in which Gat's quote comes from, Gat is referring to the year 1951. The bombing started on April 8th of 1950. Maybe Ethan just quote sniped from the wiki without proper research. That's the only way I can rationalize how he came to that conclusion. Shlaim's Three Worlds, the book Ethan was quoting from and lambasting Hasan for not reading, even refutes this claim by explaining that by the end of April 1950, the number of Jews who had registered to leave Iraq was 25,000, so Ethan was off by about 75,000. It's true that the bombings alone are not the sole reason as to why Jews wanted to flee Iraq. They were subjected to horrible conditions in many instances. It's 100% accurate. Avi Shlaim concedes that point, but the bombs did play a role. As Avi Shlaim put it, there was a direct correlation between the bombings and the rise in the number of applicants to emigrate from Iraq. Shlaim alleges that the majority of the bombings were committed by Zionist forces, and they, along with the rest of the bombings, were opportunistically utilized to serve Zionist propaganda. His entire point is that the State of Israel, which claimed to be a safe haven for Jews, was actively harming and harassing Jews across the region to serve the interests of their supremacist project. So when Ethan accuses Hasan of denying the flight of Arab Jews...
You deny the flight, you deny the trauma of Middle Eastern Jews.
I don't deny the flight,
You
Ethan.
absolutely deny the trauma.
You are attributing...
Ethan doesn't understand that Hasan is not denying anything. He's simply pointing out how the flight of Arab Jews ought not be used to offset or diminish the severity of the Nakba, which happens to be Avi Shlaim's assessment as well. Now, if you want to argue that Shlaim is wrong or his historiography is flawed, that's another conversation. But we're talking about Shlaim because Ethan was the one using his book as an authoritative account. Even though Hasan didn't include all of what I just said in this video during his debate, and frankly, Ethan probably wouldn't have been receptive to it at that moment, Hasan's argument that Iraqis are not Palestinians
Because
no longer
Iraqis
safe.
are not Palestinian!
and therefore Palestinians shouldn't be punished for actions taken in Iraq was the appropriate argument to make, in my opinion. Nothing that happened to Jewish people across the MENA region justifies what happened to Palestinians. It doesn't justify the fact that Palestinians were made refugees while Jews from the MENA region were able to settle in Palestine and expropriate Palestinian property. When Ethan reduces Iraqis, Moroccans, Egyptians, Palestinians, and others into a single monolith, calling them simply
fucking Arabs, anti-Semitic
There you
Arabs.
go.
he tacitly justifies the crimes committed against Palestinians by lumping them in with other groups and making them pay for the wrongdoings of others. This is also a tactic used by the Zionist project to avoid responsibility for compensating Palestinians for the property they lost and are still owed. Ethan actually does this exact thing in the debate. He equates the loss of Jewish property across the region to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the expropriation of their property.
How would
What
they
do you
go
mean,
back
how?
and reclaim their lost assets, their lost property?
Even though the ethnic cleansing of Palestine had already begun well before the Nakba. Quote, Israel came under strong international pressure to allow the 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees in 1948 either to return to their homes or to receive compensation. Israel flatly rejected the right of return. This left the alternative of compensation, but this too, Israel was extremely reluctant to concede. In this context, the idea arose of offsetting the property left behind by the Palestinian refugees against the property of Iraqi Jews. Again, Arab Jews got Palestinian land and property. Palestinians got ethnically cleansed. This is not the same. Also, it's worth mentioning that many of these MENA countries were under European colonial rule during this time. The fact that Ethan actually tries to make this double exodus Jewish Nakba point in both his content nuke and in his debate with Hasan,
You brought
really
that up deliberately to say more Jews were displaced than Palestinians
I think that's
were.
an interesting fact that you clearly don't fucking ever want to mention because
Why
it
would
really
you bring up
messes
that
up your
fact?
beautiful little
Why
narrative.
would
all while citing Avi Shlaim, who openly detests this conflation, is a testament to either Ethan's stupidity or his dishonesty. It's important to understand that reducing this issue down to mere Arab anti-Semitism overlooks the actions of all the actors involved and flattens the complexity of the situation in a way that plays a role in justifying what happened to the Palestinians. To show you once more what Shlaim said about conflating the Jewish plight with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it is the propaganda of the victors. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas the Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying. Poor form of Ethan to skip past this while bastardizing Avi Shlaim's book. I don't think Avi would approve of this conflation while also claiming that the Arabs were responsible for creating Zionists.
The Arabs created 1 million Zionists because they're anti-Semitic.
In reality, the Zionist project, underway since the 1800s, was one of the factors that contributed to the rise of pan-Arab nationalism, not the other way around. Again, my point here is not that there was no hatred toward Jewish people in the MENA region. It is not that the Iraqi bombings were the sole reason for Jewish flight from Iraq. My point is simply to illustrate how Ethan is an unreliable source on these topics. He cites Avi Shlaim, invokes his authority, and then bastardizes his work so thoroughly that he ends up arguing for the exact opposite of Shlaim's thesis. The comparison between the Nakba and the Jewish flight to Israel is deeply flawed. The Zionist project had been underway for decades prior, and pan-Arab nationalism was largely a reaction to it, as well as to broader European meddling. Jews who fled MENA countries were able to settle in Palestine and expropriate Palestinian homes and property. Palestinians, on the other hand, were violently displaced, denied return, and are still denied that right to this day. These are asymmetrical situations, and trying to force a false equivalence between them amounts to Nakba denialism. Anyway, this shit is agonizing to go through, but before I end the video, I want to quickly move to another topic that Ethan and Hasan briefly touched on, the comparison between Israel-Palestine and apartheid South Africa. I don't want to get into the whole would Nelson Mandela support violent resistance debate. It feels kind of awkward and distracts from the more important point, which is the conditions in apartheid South Africa were significantly different from what we see in Palestine today. As Noam Chomsky argued, the conditions Palestinians are subjected to are worse and more violent than those imposed on the indigenous people of South Africa. The black population in South Africa was relied upon for labor, whereas the Palestinian population is treated by the Israeli state as something to be done away with. And if you don't want to accept that argument from Chomsky because he didn't live under apartheid, then take it from Desmond Tutu, the South African bishop who said that what Israel does to Palestinians is, in many instances, worse than what occurred in South Africa. The Bantustans weren't routinely bombed, nor were they systematically targeted by snipers. There was absolutely violence and horrific, unforgivable atrocities committed against the black population of South Africa, but they were still needed alive for labor. They didn't experience the kind of regular, indiscriminate assaults that Palestinians face today, the so-called mowing of the lawn. This difference alone makes the Nelson Mandela comparison inapplicable in my opinion. The conditions Palestinians are subjected to are far more violent, and as a result, the response is bound to be more violent as well. It's an unfortunate reality, but the blame ultimately lies with the occupying force. Those who maintain apartheid structures and uphold an oppressive system are responsible for the violence that system produces. As Frantz Fanon wrote in the opening line of The Wretched of the Earth, decolonization is always a violent event. Anyway, I am done talking about Ethan Klein unless he responds to one of my videos. Funnily enough, the only one who responded to the last one was the fucking cartoon guy. So I mean, good on him.